I'm short. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning. I'm actually wondering why you're sitting at the back, because probably when the distribution of the budget is made, those at the back might get little, and those in front might get a little bit more. I'm just joking, colleagues. So, good morning. The Principal and Vice Chancellor, Professor Francis Peterson, the Chief Directorate, Expenditure, Planning, and National Treasury Director, Mr. Keta Dlamini, Director of Budget Reform, Mr. Andisile Best, Policy Analyst, National Budgets, Ms. Matsidiso Masilwa, the Vice Rector, Academic, Dr. Angela van Staden, Principal of South Campus, Dr. Maria Madiope, the Acting Dean of Economic Sciences, Economic Management Sciences, and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Poverty, Inequality, and Economic Development, Professor Philip Berger, the Dean of Humanities, Professor Heidi Hudson, the Dean of Natural Agricultural Sciences, Professor Fermulian, the Dean of Theology and Religion, Professor Rantwa Litsusa, the Dean of Student Affairs, Mr. Puram Golombani, the Principal of Maluti TVET College, Mr. Mabena, external stakeholders, UFS staff and students, the Student Representative Council, good morning. Apparently, if we don't do the table of precedence, we would not have obliged to Treasury requirements as a government entity. So we have to make sure that everything is done and properly, and probably when they rethink and engage on budget systems, universities might get a larger cut than they currently do. So it's important to do that. So colleagues, we are delighted that Treasury has made this an opportune moment for them to share on the budget systems and processes that are undertaken when national budgets are determined. In particular, it would be great for us to know, as the University of the Free State community, that when a call by Treasury for 8 universities to have the opportunity to have them present the post-budget discussions, when we pitched not only as the UFS, but also understanding that we have a higher education collaborative initiative that Professor Francis has agitated for, wherein institutions of higher learning within the province collaborate on a range of issues that are aimed at ensuring that higher education contribution at local, national, and global level and its impact is felt. So we are delighted that we didn't think of this as only an initiative of the UFS, but it took that regional footprint, including with the Northern Cape, with Sol Plaatje universities. I'm not going to do the introductory remarks because that's the role that the Vice Chancellor and Rector will play. But I just want to state that national budgets are interesting systems and policy arena that many of us often shy away from participating in or giving influence to. But they are important because if resources are allocated that are aimed at ensuring that society determines the priorities of what is seen as important in the life of South Africa, it is imperative that higher education contribute to how such should be made. Questions around gender budgeting have arisen in many instances where feminist scholars across the globe, including in South Africa, including within the United Nations systems, have asked whether national budgets take into cognizance the distribution of population impacts in societies. So there are critical dialogical issues that may arise from that. But there are also sectors that have asked in the main, not necessarily in the South African budgeting system, but in the global budgeting system when budgets of nations are analyzed. Why is it often easy for budgets not to be allocated to the most basic arenas such as education, health, and welfare, and others? And I'm definitely that these are some of the questions that we may raise. Sometimes in the advanced economies, the challenges that scholars have raised is that the investments or budget allocations for military, space research, and others seem to be a little higher than those on questions that eradicate poverty. So if we look at the Agenda 2063, if we look at the NDP, the National Development Plan of South Africa, which at least is getting into its third decade of implementation, we may and we should ask the questions, does the budget that is being presented to us speak or relate or align with some of those aspirations that are entailed there? If not, how then could we as the University of the Free State and all the stakeholders aligned to us raise these questions for future considerations? So thank you very much, and you're welcome to this deliberative process. And we would like our colleagues and friends from Treasury to really feel comfortable that as the university, that we are not just going to listen to the budget presentation, but we are going to engage robustly. Before I sit, I'd like to invite the Vice Chancellor and Rector, Professor Peterson. Thank you, Professor Peterson.
Right, thank you very much, Vice Rector Professor Pulenglen Kabula. And I also just would like to, from my side, once again also welcome our colleagues from the Treasury for being here and for giving us a post-budget presentation, and for allowing us as not only as the University of the Free State but also as the region to be able to engage with the budget. Now, when we look at National Treasury, people often ask what the role of National Treasury is, and I think what Professor Pulenglen Kabula has indicated is that government have a set of programs and priority areas, and the budget is actually supposed to support that. But that is not that easy, and I would imagine my colleagues will tell you how do you balance those different priorities and obviously also the programs that has been identified. So that is how I see the role of National Treasury, and it's against that context that I think the presentation probably will also inform us a little bit more. The focus of this morning is really to allow us an opportunity to see how the national budget has been put together, but also how that has been unpacked. There's obviously different things that feeds into it, but how has that been constituted? And we'll get a little bit more insight into that. But for me, that is important is when we talk about the budget, it's not only about the role that National Treasury is playing, but the fact that there are various resources that institutions of higher learning might have, and indeed have, to be able to contribute to budget input. And we just this morning very briefly talk about even the resources that we have at the University of the Free State in terms of research into fiscal issues, that Treasury also come and say, well, can you give us a little bit more information? And I think that is for me quite important, that as higher education institutions, in fact, if you look at our budget for education, then I think that is probably the largest budget item in the whole budget. If you look at the allocation, I think that total amount is close to about 400 billion rand that's been allocated. So education actually get quite a large slice. but to what extent is that prioritized? And I just would like to indicate that it's for me important that we work together to be able to provide some input into the system. Now, as Professor Poleng have indicated, a National Treasury is visiting higher education institutions. They're probably visiting about 7 or 8. And the idea is to see how we can not only get higher education institutions in this room, staff and students, but also some of our external stakeholders that might be closely related to higher education, so that they also can get a sense of how important the construction of the budget is, but how are these things put together. Now, I'm not going to talk about the budget itself, but some of the concerns I remember before Minister Tito Mboweni gave his budget vote or budget speech was about, so what is the budget, or how is the budget going to impact the individual? And I think after the budget speech, there was a lot of people that said it was actually a very friendly budget relative to the individual. The other part was to say, but how are we going to try to get more investment into the country? So how would private sector come to invest into the economy, into South Africa? And that's often related to what is the level of company tax, how do you ensure that there's economic growth? And to a certain extent, I think with all the constraints and the challenges, I also believe that there was a lot of interventions done in that space too. But the third one was probably the whole issue of widening the budget deficit, and I think it's at the moment about 6.8% of GDP. Now that's the major thing. Are we going to get that right in a way? So those are some of the things that I think is important to understand against the background of the Moody rating agency that will come, and I don't know whether they're going to postpone their rating. They're supposed to be due the end of March, but they might postpone it later to see what impact the budget promises, how that implementation of the budget promises are actually working, and specifically, how do you get the cuts that the budget have been talking to? How well is that being implemented? So I think it's a very interesting space. It's a space where we, as higher education institutions, need to play a role. It's a space that we need to say it's not only the role of Treasury or the Ministry of Finance. It's a role that we all have to play. The resources that we have as a university, as a collaborative, regional collective, and how can we also provide input. So from my perspective, again, the University of Free State and the other higher education institutions in this region, in our province specifically, but also the Northern Cape, Free State in the Northern Cape, would like to welcome once again our Treasury colleagues, and we certainly are looking forward to your presentation, and very much so the engagements thereafter. Once again, welcome. So I don't know who's going to start first, but then I'm going to, it's Mr. Keta Dlamini. I'm going to ask him to come to the podium, and then obviously we'll start with the presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. If the folks at WITS knew that I got such a good welcome at the University of the Free State, I'm pretty sure that they'd be surprised. But thank you so much, Vice Chancellor, Vice Rector, Deans, other Vice Chancellors represented here, Deputy Vice Chancellor. Thank you so much for the welcome. I don't know how much time we have. Andisile and I have all day. Our flight's only at 7. So we'll engage on this review, on this particular presentation. But as I said, before I start this particular presentation, and I think I go into some of the numbers, which are quite grim. I think on the sidelines of this conversation, I was just talking to Professor Philippe Berger. And even after the engagement, I think it was in April, and you've done a lot of work on fiscal sustainability issues. I've borrowed your model for my own master's dissertation, so I know you've been thinking about it quite a lot. So one of the things that we try and do, even after this presentation about the numbers, and Disilo will go into some of the databases, is also just build the research links about thinking how we communicate these fiscal issues better. My directorate is directly responsible for maintaining the long-term fiscal model, and I think you were at that conference where we talked about the long-term fiscal model. How do we fund the university sector? It's actually what fed into the discussions for the HEA Commission, and ultimately determine the budgets for fully subsidized higher education and training. So we'll go into this, and listen, I think let's be frank. My job was to defend, obviously, this presentation and this budget, but I think, feel free to be frank, feel free to criticize. I think that's very important that we have that debate. I said some things at a conference. I'm one of the speech writers for the budget speech, so I said some things at a conference which wasn't quite correct. So you'll forgive me. So sometimes you have these thoughts, but we don't. It doesn't end up in the speech, but We'll correct that. So the main message of the budget is consolidation, basically stabilizing steps to stabilize the public finances, then steps to ultimately achieve faster growth. And so there's an intermediate step which we call reform, structural reform, based on the National Treasury paper. I don't know how many of you have read it, which places a lot of emphasis on how can we do things so that we reignite the private sector. I think to your point, Vice Chancellor, about getting greater investment, that's the main message of this budget. We are consolidating so that the fiscal framework supports greater investment, but also consolidating so that we give confidence to the private sector that they can invest, and so reforming our network industries, particularly Eskom, particularly Transnet, so that this economy grows. And that's how we think we achieve a path to stabilization. So in terms of allocation, you're absolutely right, Professor. Learning and culture receive the largest share of non-interest spending, followed by health, followed by social development. These are things we do because we think they support long-term growth. However, compared to when we tabled the budget in 2019, growth has been severely revised down. That's partly reflecting, obviously, what's been happening globally in terms of trade tensions and export performance. But I think a large part of it, and we can't shy away from it, is what's happening with Eskom. And so we'll talk to the allocations that we're providing to Eskom and the reforms that we're undertaking to make sure that Eskom is able to deliver electricity. The position of the public finances has worsened, driven largely by undercollection, severe undercollection on tax reform. Now, the funny thing is, there we go. Okay. The interesting thing is that because of the recession and the fact that growth has been so weak, we actually, and I'll show you a slide when we go on in the presentation, are collecting about 29.6% of GDP, which is the highest levels that we've achieved since the crisis. It's almost at our pre-crisis peak. That's also just a function of the economy is a lot smaller than we thought it was. And so this budget proposes net cuts of 156 billion rand. The total cuts are 260 billion rand. But because we are providing financial support to South African Airways and Eskom, largely, and also then reversing some of the budget cuts that we implemented in 2019, the net cut is 156 billion. We can have a debate about how we can achieve this. This is largely from the Public Service Wage Bill, but also cuts to some programs that were slow spending or also not just achieving their targets. Some of them are capital grants, unfortunately, and I think that has implications for long-term growth. And again, we can have a debate about whether that's the right choice or the wrong choice and why we think we should go for that choice. So, as I said, the growth outlook revised lower, largely reflecting weaker exports. We think that will somewhat improve, but as you can see, that the picture from exports last year was a contraction in our export performance. That's largely driven by weaker global performance, global growth, particularly due to trade tensions. And then the other thing, of course, is weaker GFC, or weaker investment gross fixed capital formation, driven by the electricity constraint. Unfortunately, the electricity constraint, as you can see, means that growth doesn't climb above 1.6% in the medium term. That's the next 3 years of the forecast. A bright spot in our forecast is that inflation is lower. Now, unfortunately, low inflation also means that the economy is slightly lower, which also then is why we are collecting a lot less in tax. So it's a double-edged sword, but we think that having a strong macroeconomic framework underpinned by low inflation, free-floating exchange rates ultimately supports longer-term growth. So even though in the shorter term it's hitting us in terms of revenue performance, it is in the long term, I think, to the good of South Africa that we have such low inflation. As a result, the current account deficit is slightly wider. So how does what are our proposals? The growth paper that we released in 2018, it's now a government paper, as the minister likes to emphasize, prioritizes a number of reforms. So on the electricity side, what we see is that a reformed ESCOM, which is separated now into functionally separated but not legally separated, into 3 businesses, a generation, transmission, and distribution business, will sit alongside other private sector players. So we want IPPs to come into the sector. We're doing an emergency procurement of 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts of power to alleviate the energy shortfall, alongside then the proposals that were gazetted in the Integrated Resources Plan by the Minister of Energy, Minerals and Energy. Is that right? Minerals and Energy, yeah. And then ports, we're taking steps to alleviate, or rather accelerate performance in ports. In rail, we want, again, greater private sector participation. So we think by introducing this economic regulator and also then, getting the price channel right, that will encourage greater competition in the ports network, and also drive down the cost of exports. Digital migration, very important. We've been talking about this for a very long time. When we were talking about the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is still in discussion, of course, part of the thinking about the Sovereign Wealth Fund is that as we raise the revenue from selling spectrum, this could go into a Sovereign Wealth Fund. We can discuss the necessity of a sovereign wealth fund and whether you guys think it's the wrong or the right approach, but certainly from a policy perspective, that's where we're going. Of course, we're moving ahead in other technologies like 5G. A 5G network is rolling out, but it's quite important that we think about, the far-flung areas of the country and how they can access, internet connectivity, where 5G is more an urban technology. So we can think about that. And then there are other master plans. This Biz Hub Portal is a great thing. It's already launched. It's already in operation. So if you're starting a business, you're able to register with SARS, with the Unemployment Insurance Fund, with the Compensation Fund, all in the space of a day. So it's part of steps we're taking to ease, doing business. But of course, as I said, the big reforms are around what we're doing with our network industries. So this is a fiscal framework. We call this the jaws of death. And I think you can see why. We're spending a lot more than we are earning. But as I said, if you look at the gray graph in particular, and I think it's, the red graph is a bit distracting, but if you look at the gray graph in particular, you'll see that what we are collecting in terms of revenue as a share of GDP, so as out of the economy, how much we're extracting in terms of revenue, it's never been higher. In 2006, 2007, 8 was the peak, and we're almost there. The problem has been the structural shift in spending that came about in the global financial crisis, and that's what we're dealing with. And Vice Chancellor, I was a first-year student at that time, so I can't be blamed. It's someone else's mess, but I'm trying to fix it up. And what you then see is that we've got a much wider deficit. Again, also the largest deficit that we've had since the Second World War. The president asked this question. We had a meeting with the president, and he asked, if you compare pre-apartheid South Africa and post-apartheid South Africa, have you ever seen? And we had to say, quite frankly, to the president that, these levels of spending were only achieved during the Second World War, when South Africa was participating in the Second World War. So, it's something quite extraordinary, and I think something that we are trying to take steps in order to stabilize and improve. And it's also, I think, in the context of discussions of, is this an austerity budget? You always point the fact that we've never had such high spending, never ever had such high spending. So the debate around austerity, I think, we can have, but I always argue that, the level of spending is such that it's very difficult to suggest that this is an austerity budget. As I said, colleagues, we're trying to shift towards a better composition of spending. As you can see, a large proportion of spending, that's the 36% number that you see at the bottom, is now taken up by the compensation of civil servants, public servants. This is consolidated spending, so it includes main provincial government, social security funds, and other public entities like the National Library of South Africa. And Disile and I want to go and see a few museums here, but it's also the pay for the museum workers that you see. So all of that goes into this, what we call the consolidated government, all of those public entities. And so what we're trying to achieve with this fiscal framework is really prioritize capital spending, because that's what's going to achieve, I think, faster long-term potential growth, which will then support what we see are will be increasing pressures on parts of our social spending. And we can talk about some of the things that we learned in our MTBPS assessment of long-term fiscal policy. Right. The big changes to spending, I think I've already mentioned. A lot of it goes to state-owned companies. Picture we'd like to change. We want state-owned companies to operate on a sustainable basis. 24 billion rand goes to critical spending priorities. The big change to the fiscal framework, and this is what we're negotiating over the next 2 weeks when the new fiscal year starts, is this implementation of a wage bill reduction of 160 billion. Now, this is not necessarily a cut to salaries of civil servants. There are many ways we can achieve this. Headcount growth, how we grow how we implement the final year of the new wage agreement. So it's by no means a suggestion that there'll be some sort of across the board cut. There are many options about how we can achieve this, and we're negotiating with the unions about how this can be achieved. And so this is what the picture looks like. So consolidated spending over the next 3 years, starting from the financial year starting in April, ending in the financial year March 31, 2023, consolidated spending will be 4.7 trillion rand, or down from 4.9 trillion rand, so representing about a 300 billion rand cut. So 4.7 trillion rand, 156 billion rand reduction in non-interest spending. I could go through the contingency reserve, but basically the contingency reserve, we've reduced it. The contingency reserve is what we set aside basically to meet unforeseen spending pressures like disasters or policy disasters. I didn't say that. I didn't say that. And then the skills development levies and in and out. It's basically what goes to funding the SETAs. So it's paid by industry. It's reflected in the fiscal framework, but essentially what we receive is what we pay out to the SETA. So in theory, it doesn't affect our borrowing, doesn't affect the picture of debt. Right. This is the big problem. So when we laid out our MTBPS estimates, we expected to collect about just under 1.4 trillion rand, 1,369 billion. And now we are hit with revenue shortfalls of around 10.7. Now, because the economy is smaller, partly driven by those inflation changes I told you about, but also driven by the fact is lower real growth. We've had to revise down our revenue estimates by about 112 billion rand. So that's the 35. That's the summation of the 35, the 43, and the 48, which obviously then which is why we have such a big deficit, and that's the picture that we have to reverse. So even though we're collecting 29.6% of GDP or thereabout in terms of revenue, the level of spending has shifted up so high, so structurally high, and something we're trying to change, that even what is fairly robust revenue collections just simply can't keep up with the pace of spending. And that's why we've revised lower assumptions. We think our assumptions are prudent, but as I said, one of the things we haven't factored in, for example, and I'm sure the question will come up, has been the impact of coronavirus and what that's going to do to global growth. Whereas we thought there'd be an easing of trade tensions, it seems to us that we will have another growth shock globally that might affect our revenue projections. So we need to think about those things. This was the most popular element of the budget, I learned, which is the fact that, for the very first time, I think in 6 years, we haven't really raised new revenue. We did plan to raise about 10 billion rand in revenue, but we saw that given the size of given the weakness in the economy, it probably wouldn't be prudent to place any additional pressure in terms of fiscal consolidation on the revenue side. So in addition to not raising tax rates, we've given above inflation tax relief to income earners. I don't know university students if they necessarily benefit from this, but I think it's a boost to the economy. We are taking tentative steps to rethink corporate income tax and whether we can't make changes around the corporate income tax level. We find that we're slightly out of line with what's happening globally. So typically now, I think corporate income tax levels for OECD countries are somewhere between 19 and 22% corporate income tax rates. And we're thinking these could be some steps that we take, partly at the direction of the president, in order to improve the conditions of doing business. Something that we discussed with the president last week, and he'd be very keen on seeing these things. So these are things that we're considering. Obviously, as I said, no major tax increases, but there were tax increases in this budget, in line with inflation. So, if you get a real inflation, which civil servants may not own, then you should be able to cover these, but the fuel levy will increase by 25 cents, and the road accident fund levy will increase by 9 cents. The fuel levy will increase by 16 cents, and the road accident fund by 9 cents, which results in a 25 cents increase to the fuel levy. And I think, this is one of my favorite tax policy changes. The contribution limit for tax-free savings has increased by about 3,000 rand from the 1st of March. I think it has increased to 3,000 rand, not by 3,000 rand, because otherwise you might find yourself getting a huge tax penalty. I learned the hard way. Don't over-contribute to your tax-free savings account. But actually, I think what you can now contribute is about 3,000 rand in the fiscal year starting March 2020. So you can already increase your contribution. That's about 36,000 rand that you can invest tax-free, which is great. I don't think we need to talk about alcohol and excise duties at a university, because those things don't happen. But again, in line with Wits, at Wits we're very Catholic. We're more Catholic than the Pope. So anyway, again, those are increased largely in line with inflation. If you smoke a cigar, as the minister always tells us, you're hard hit because that's above inflation. But I guess rich folk we don't care too much about. So those are the main tax policy changes. Basically, no change in overall revenue raised, no major tax increases, and a lot of the consolidation is then the pressure of consolidation is placed on the expenditure side. That's the big takeaway from this budget. This is the fiscal framework. So that graphical picture that I presented to you, this is how it's represented, I guess, more in a tabular form. And the most important thing, I think, Vice Chancellor, you've already mentioned it, is that 6.8% deficit. Yes, driven by ESCOM funding, but largely driven by the big revenue shortfalls that we're expecting. We're going to try and drive down that deficit to around 5.7%. But even then, what I'm going to show you on the next slide is that even if we drive down the deficit to 5.7%, the debt trajectory does not stabilize. So it's still a significant amount of borrowing, beyond, I think, a level that is prudent. So what we're proposing in this budget, I mean, I think we must be honest, are just only first steps, tentative steps. There are more difficult political decisions that need to be made in order to stabilize this level of debt. We're already at 61% of debt in the coming, in this current fiscal year, and in the next fiscal year, it will already be 66%. That translates to about 3 trillion rand worth of debt. That's going to increase by 1 trillion rand over the next 3 years. Now, when I got into government, and this is, which was like 5 years ago, the debt was like 1.5 trillion rand. So we've doubled it, you and I. Between the two of us, we need to pay back the money. So going into it, these are the allocations to the priority service delivery areas. Debt service costs are also the fastest growing area of spending. Not a good thing, because you're basically paying rich bankers instead of that money going into core service delivery priorities like learning and culture or health. So that obviously is why we want to change this composition of spending. And so I think this particular picture is quite important. I think people are always, it always surprises me that people are always shocked at how, over time, debt service costs, tends to shift up in this graph, and, hopefully we don't get to the top. We're going to take steps not to get to the top. But people are always struck by how this graph changes over time. So if you then think about the budget in a different way, investment, right? This particular budget prioritizes investment. Now, that's partly because we are slowing. The 160 billion rand cut means that there's a significant slowdown in what we spend on salaries, compensation. So below inflation increases to compensation, the overall compensation budget. How we achieve it is subject to negotiation. And which means that capital transfers, with what we're doing with the infrastructure fund, is the fastest, capital payments is the fastest growing element of the budget. Now, capital transfers are slightly different. So there are parts of investment that happen on the budget. So some investments receive funding on the budget. In some cases, we transfer money to agencies like SANRAL or PRASA. Now, the problem is infrastructure projects tend to be slow spending. And so what happens is these slow spending programs, we just stop raising money for them until, they get back online. So we've looked at what programs are slow spending and reduce the capital transfers. So, integrated rapid transport systems, the PRASA investment programs, those tend to be very slow spending programs, lots of underspending. So some of the savings have come there. But, as they pick up, we'll think about how do we find funding on the budget or through borrowing in order to support those programs. This is the division of revenue, I guess, very important. The minister had a statement of, for every South African, the state is their municipality. And of course, Mangaung is I think one of the biggest cities that's on a program for debt management. I think there was a default, unfortunately, in Mangaung. So I think, it's quite important that you guys see how the allocation is split up. So again, about 48%, which is slightly higher than usual, of allocations go to national government. That's just largely a reflection of the funding that we're providing to state-owned companies. 43% to provinces, and then 8.8% goes to municipalities, so local governments. And we're taking steps. Look, we're going to take steps. The deputy minister's on top of issues when it comes to local government financial management, budget management, the issues here in Mangawong, which are very well known. We're going to take steps. Unfortunately, there was a default, but I think those things will be resolved and ultimately improved. Of course, the final division of revenue is dependent on the negotiations we have with the public sector unions. So it's a very politically fraught budget, I must admit. I'm a civil servant, but I must admit it's a very politically fraught budget. It requires a lot of political consensus in order to implement a lot of the budget proposals. So again, we can discuss that. So look, we've talked about this, about municipal funding, about funded budgets. As I said, there you've got high-level political representation from our deputy ministers to ensure that our local governments are operating on a sound financial basis. Well, this is also quite an embarrassing picture. This is our support to SOCs. Now, look, again, we can have a discussion about this. 2008 to 2010 was initially envisaged as a loan. So a lot of the money, I should say, has gone to Eskom, as you'd imagine. Eskom is South Africa's largest company. So in terms of resource requirements, Eskom would probably be the biggest chunk of this picture. Now, 2008-9 to 2010, that was a loan in order to complete Medupi and Kusile, okay? There were issues around the planning of Medupi and Kusile. There were issues around the financial position of Eskom, even at the time. So that was augmented with a 350 billion rand guarantee facility. In 2015-16, we saw that the financial position of Eskom had deteriorated, and so there was emergency funding of about 23 billion rand that was provided to Eskom through the sale of assets, Vodacom shares. But unfortunately, we weren't able to stabilize the financial position of Eskom. And so what government is committed to is a 230 billion rand support package over the next 10 years. Some of it has been front-loaded in order to stabilize Eskom, facilitate a restructuring of Eskom. As I said, this breaking up of Eskom into three parts that is operating in a transformed electricity sector with private sector players. Also taking into account, I think a lot of our green commitments, our carbon reduction commitments, Eskom is the largest polluter in the country. And so, we need to think about the transformation of the energy sector in that particular context as well. SAA, the problems there are well known, but I'm sure many of you fly business class, so you're quite happy. You're quite happy that we're saving SAA. But look, again, the support that we've provided in the budget to SAA is only for debt repayments. So it doesn't take into account the restructuring costs, which we expect the business rescue practitioner to come with in a couple of weeks or months. So what we've allocated to SAA at the moment is not for the restructuring. Denel, as you know, again for debt. So a lot of the problems with SOCs, unfortunately, and I guess because we're in Mangawong, you'd know, around debt management, right? And how do we manage debt management? How do we manage revenue? How do you manage your cash flows better? So these are the things that we need to resolve, and we're trying to resolve. And I would say that's the number one, number two, and number three issues facing SOCs and actually large parts of the public sector. Right, the social security funds. Again, the unemployment insurance fund. And questions often asked about the unemployment insurance fund is that we have fast increasing unemployment levels in this country. So 29%, and it's been steadily going up over the years. But if you look at the surpluses collected by the unemployment insurance fund, they're huge. They're the second largest investor in the economy. Similarly with the compensation fund. Then if you look on the flip side, though, the road accident fund is now actually the largest liability that we have outside of the national debt. It's now larger than Eskom, the 329 billion rand. that you cite there, by the financial year end, Eskom only has a 300 billion rand, 296 billion rand contingent liability. The contingent liability from the Road Accident Fund is about 329 billion, rising to about 600 billion or 593 billion in the third year. So again, this is something that is I think a worrying picture. This is like a big problem. And you were actually paying for it, right? You're paying for it. This is why you have these very large increases to the fuel levy. I think there was a statistic that was put out, and I can check the number. But 40% of the price you pay at the pump is actually not for petrol, but to service liabilities like this. And so we need to think about how do we have a more equitable way of sharing the costs of this, because I don't think it's particularly sustainable. So the final thing about the fiscal framework is that we'll take steps to improve spending efficiency. So how do we support growth? It's by improving spending efficiency. So procurement, we recognize that, look, procurement, yes, there's issues of corruption and misspending there, but it is also the case that it's become very difficult and onerous to do business with government. And so how do we reform procurement so that we make it easy for, even within government, it actually is quite difficult to procure services from another government department. So how do you make it easier to procure services from other government departments? Subnational reforms, very important, because ultimately, Andisile and I come from Pretoria, but we don't live in the National Treasury, we live in a municipality. And it's important that our municipality functions well. We don't even have a mayor, right, at the moment. Claims against the state, so medical legal claims. Look, part of this is like getting sectors to work better, institutions to work better, the health sector to work better. So part of it is that, but also we just need to be reasonable when we claim against the state, right? Because the state is not some cash cow. It serves to meet core service delivery priorities. As I said, we're looking at steps to make the corporate income tax rate more in line with our peers in the OECD, support business. So we'll be looking at tax incentives, phasing out tax incentives. As the SARS commissioner was saying, that now you have a situation where companies buy other companies just to get the losses so that they aren't paying their fair share of tax. We want to get rid of those things. We have situations where people leave South Africa just to get away from paying their taxes. Again, we want to get rid of those things. We want to make sure that everyone takes their fair share. Spending reviews, very important. Again, looking at, as we reform the fiscal framework, how do we spend our money better? So making sure that the money goes to the areas of spending that, as you raised, Vice Rector, around gender budgeting, issues of inclusivity. We're taking steps there. Remuneration, our big reform, and I guess this is always quite popular with the public office bearers. So we've seen ministers flying economy class. I hear ministers are driving Mercedes-Benz C-Class, which is something I would like to do, at least before I retire. But drive a C-Class. So look, we're skimming down the benefits of public office bearers, particularly ministers and premiers, so that everyone feels like everyone's sharing the burden, sharing the pain. Okay. Right, and then finally the risk to the outlook. Coronavirus, big risk, big growth risk, but there are other growth risks. So look, Eskom, the stabilization package needs to come into place. We need to make sure that the stabilization comes into place. Our contingent liabilities, in many cases, our real liabilities, because they're no longer contingent, they're actually materializing, and that's what we've seen with Eskom. Managing those contingent liabilities better, so that we don't have these tax resources being directed towards, servicing of debt. Ultimately, as I say, what debt service is like, paying very rich bankers. Put a very good premium on what is actually low-risk debt. If you think about investing in the South African government, we've never defaulted in the, many years that the South Africa has been in existence. So you're actually getting a profit for taking absolutely no risk. So it makes absolutely no sense that we spend so much on debt service. So we need to think about managing our liabilities better, reducing our borrowing, so that over the long term, the resources can be directed to where they're needed, and particularly growing the economy. So with that, colleagues, as I said, we're looking for robust engagements. We've had some tough engagements already, so Andisile is going to demonstrate the Vuleka Mali portal. So after that, we'll have.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, the Vice-Chancellor, Vice Rector, all the deans around, all the institutions that are represented here, the student body, and the staff in general. I would like to greet you all. I'm actually excited to be here to come and share. This is just on a lighter note, yet a very important resource that all of us, I hope that by the end of today, you are going to make it your friend, basically, that you go and refer to. We take fiscal transparency very seriously within the National Treasury. And besides what one would think that by just being transparent, you are then preventing issues like corruption and whatever other negative issues that you can think about. But it is more so empowering the citizens, empowering anyone that would like to know what government intends to do or how government is budgeting its money and where the money goes really. So we have two transparency portals that National Treasury has. The first one is Vuleka Mali. Vuleka Mali focuses on the national and the provincial spheres of government. And this portal, it gives you easily accessible data. And researchers, data analysts, or anyone who likes to work with raw data will find this portal very useful. And then the other one is a Municipal Money. The focus of Municipal Money is only on local government. For obvious reasons that you have both of them, we have two different public financial management legislation, and PFMA, it's provincial and national. Therefore, it has different reporting charts. And then you have the Municipal Management Act, which also has its own different. Let's just see. Are we able to? So I would like to invite you, just on your own mobile, you are able to view these portals. They are very easy on your data, and I think the institution also provides Wi-Fi for all of you. And therefore, you should be able, you should then be able to just easily be able to go on. Okay, let's just say no to that one. Just something which is, okay, let me just click on the tabs just to let you see what's in here. On the different tabs, the first one provides you an opportunity to go or to zoom into a particular department. You already know which institution you're looking for, and then you can just go in and click on it. You can zoom in on the different sphere by looking, by filtering there. And if you want a particular year, we were only we only focused on going back 3 years when we started this portal, and just to allow an opportunity for somebody to view the 3 past years, and then we've just added the current budget now. And also, when you come to learning, you are able to browse through the different videos to familiarize yourself about the actual portal. Why this portal? Why is the budget important? How can this portal help you? Just familiarize yourself with the budget process. How can you participate in the budget process? And just to get an intro of how you are able to interpret a basic budget documentation. How is it presented? And there's also a link of procurement, how it is aligned with the budgets. We provide those in different languages, so you choose yours. You are able to give feedback at any page that you are in by clicking there. And do you find this helpful? This does not work for you? Or you were looking for something and then you didn't find it? This is an instant feedback that we encourage you to please use, because it allows us to use your feedback in order to improve the portal. This portal, it's one of the things that we pride ourselves with, is that we didn't sit at our desks and just develop it. I'm from an IT background. I could develop a portal and do it as I want. But what we did, we went out and partnered with civil society organizations who do advocacy work, budget analysis, and who have interest in what government does. And they partnered with us in order to develop the portal, and then they are also still part of the steering committee that governs all this work. And then after we develop, we went to all the provinces. We did come to this province as well. And in that, we were able to meet with the potential as well as the current users of the portal in order for them to give us inputs. And so what you see today is really an output of the work that we believe real South Africans contributed on it. A very new and exciting opportunity for you to be able to see different facilities within our space. Those who listened to Minister's speech or even watched it, this is what seemed to be fascinating him, that you are able to, you can think of anything, even if it's a particular clinic, and then you type the name, and then you can see whether there are any projects that are planned for that particular clinic or a school or any facility in your area. And then that should be able to excite you so much when you see that a structure that is close to being deliberated is going to be maintained. Now, here we have various links to other data sources that we thought, let's bring them in for you to be able to get more detailed information. Adjusted budgets, annual reports, budgets for national expenditure, and budgets for provincial, CPI links, consolidated expenditure, contributed data. This part is one where even any organization that is even outside government can actually make use of and add their own data in this portal. And this allows somebody you will log in or even register. These are the organizations that have registered on the portal, and then they are able to put in some data, whatever data you have. You may have some data that you've analyzed, whether it's a particular policy area, then you have an opportunity to come and upload here for Vuleka Mali users to be able to access. And then lastly, the frequently asked questions, as well as reading more about the project, its background, how was it developed, the project status, how can you contribute, contact details, and so on. So this is Vuleka Mali, and I would like to encourage this institution, and especially the specific faculties that make use of this type of data, to encourage it to be used. And the last one, which is similar as well, is Municipal Money. So Municipal Money, the first thing that you have an opportunity to do is to put in your exact municipality, or you can just say, computer, assess where am I? Okay, so it seems like the location settings here have been disabled. That's fine. It's been disabled. Let's say Mangaung. There you go, and then you can click, and then you can get an overview of the municipal information, even audit-related reports, their cash balances. You can see. Well, you get the reality, ne? The real situation. So, guys, this is that openness and transparency that we are bringing to you. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. It doesn't matter how bad it is. You're going to see it exactly as it is. But most importantly, that's fine. You can browse through here. You can also get some resources. And more especially on the right-hand side, you can also get videos similar to Vuleka Mali, where you can then play and familiarize yourself about any aspect. And the new addition here as well is capital projects. Similar to Vuleka Mali, you are able to then zoom in to your municipality and be able to follow a particular project. I think that is all when it comes to these fiscal transparency portal. The last thing which we would like to do is to also encourage you. Sitting here, we can steal you away from this university and you join the National Treasury. And we have various opportunities that are available. You can even look right now. And then for those who are still finalizing, okay, those who are at their final year, there are also graduate opportunities for them. We've got a CA Academy as well, and as well as the General Internship Program for 2 years. And we've had a good development. We've run a good program such that most of our graduates we are able to then retain within our organization, and they get to grow within the ranks, and then you find them being the ones who come to present to you next time. Yes, so this ends my contribution, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I think over to you.
Can we give a round of applause to Mr. Dlamini and Mr. Best, please? So thank you very much. We thought because we're a university, we wouldn't just let you off the hook and just let you do the presentation and go. So we have agreed that Professor Berger, who's an expert in this area, to come and respond to your presentation, and thereafter for us to do a Q&A and to ensure that we stimulate the discussion, but from a place of knowledge. So thank you very much, Professor Berger. You're on the podium. Do you want to speak? Oh, thank you.
Andesile, that is very interesting. I think our students and as a staff will find these data sources very, very useful. So I can just think about all the assignments that now will, improve quality. Keta, it's wonderful to see you again. And yes, so I'm not going to be too long because I think I want to open the floor also. We want to open the floor also for participation of the staff and students. But just a few comments in terms of the budget. I think when we look at the budget, I think that the two main issues, and Keta, you highlighted that, the one really big issue is the structural shift in expenditure. That's been on that level for about 10 years now. And then the other thing, of course, is the extremely low economic growth rate that we as a country face. That feeds into the revenue that we do not collect as if, because there's no income on which we can levy that. Now, if you have a look since 2016-17 up to 2019-20, the budget or the public debt GDP ratio went from 50 to 60%. That's over basically a 3-year period. Over the next 3-year period, it's going to increase with another 10 percentage points. Okay, so that is what Keta highlighted. There's no real slowdown in the rate at which the debt increases. And work that I've done with Estian Carlos has shown that basically what we need is about a 2 to 3 percentage point cut as percent of GDP in expenditure. Okay, so that will sort of stabilize this. Now, this sounds like, oh, it's just 3% of but it's of GDP. So this is a very big number when you translate that into rands and cents. The thing that we very often talk about is what we call the primary balance. Now, the primary balance is, so we usually hear about the overall budget deficit, which is just revenue minus expenditure. The primary balance is basically the difference between revenue and the non-interest expenditure. Okay, so because interest, you got to pay interest. That's the one thing you can't cut. So if you need to cut on the other expenditure. And the numbers that Keta has put up shows that by 2022-23, that is still a deficit of 0.8%. And that is if nothing goes wrong. At the moment, it's about 2.8%. So that's still a deficit. Now, what the literature shows you, or what the actual mathematics actually shows you, is that if your interest rate is higher than the growth rate, then you need to run a primary surplus to stabilize your debt GDP ratio. Now, we are still in deficit territory and will be so for the next 2-3 years. The problem, though, is that that rate of debt to GDP ratio of 71%, to which we are moving, that is just the third year in as far as we do the medium-term forecast. If we want to stabilize it at 71% after that, it would mean that we need to move from that primary deficit of 0.8% of GDP to a 1.6% surplus. It's a 2.4% swing that we'll have to do. Now, that ain't going to happen. Okay, so we can only do so gradually. So that means that, and we've done over the last week, actually, after the budget, some projections to see, where we are likely to move. If we stay at the primary deficit of 2.6 and growth remains this depressing 0.5%, then the debt GDP ratio will hit 100% by about 2026. Okay? If we can get the primary deficit down to 1.5%, which is sort of the average since 2012, and we can get growth up to, at 2%, then it goes to 100% by 2030. Okay, so it's still unsustainable. If we want to stabilize it, okay, what we might do is, move to a zero primary balance, no deficit, no surplus by roughly 2025, 26, and then move to a surplus by about 2028, 29, this is over the next decade, a surplus of about 1.6%, then we will be able to stabilize it at about 81%. Okay? Now, it's unlikely that we will get a much better scenario than that. So we will probably add another 20 percentage points to this debt-GDP ratio over the next decade. And the big challenge will be how to stabilize that. Now, the other thing is, if you want to bring it back to where we were just 4 years ago, at 50%, we will have to, from that then onwards, we will have to, with growth rates of about 2%, or 2.7%, the average since 94, we will have to run primary surpluses of about 3.5% up to, from about late 2020s up to about 2037, which is like over the next many years. Then only we will return from where we came only 4 years ago. And I think that, and that is a 6% swing, which is politically basically not feasible. So I think what it means is that it is highly unlikely that we will see public debt GDP ratios below 60% in the next 2 decades, to be frank, unless we have growth like we had in the mid-2000s, when we had growth of 3 to 5.5%. Okay, so that shows what I said initially, the importance of getting economic growth going. The problem, of course, is with debt ratios that high, it has implications. The first implication is that you are fiscally very fragile. So if something like the coronavirus or another 2008 crisis hits you, it's very easy to bump your debt GDP ratio out of kilter, and you will resume that upward trend. So there's, and that, the other thing is there's also no room for counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Okay? Usually when we go into a recession, we would like to let the deficit go a bit up to stimulate the economy. That will be out of the question then. Okay? So, and we will depend completely on monetary policy to do the heavy lifting of counter-cyclical policy. The problem, though, that monetary policy will have is because the debt GDP ratio is so high, the risk premium included in interest rates will be very high. And that's where the Moody's thing comes in. Okay? Well, how moody will Moody's be? We'll have to see that. So all of that tells us that we really need to reduce that expenditure and work on our growth. Now, the cuts in wages, that's a first step, and I was happy when you said initially these are first steps. It's painful steps, but these are just first steps. There are even more painful steps that will need to be taken if we are to balance this. If you look at what can be done, well, the one thing is to look at revenue. So there's all sorts of revenue gaps that, loopholes that can be cut. Making sure that the tax collections, that's what Mr. Kieswetter is now doing, that the tax collections improve. But there's also, as you've seen, the revenue GDP ratio is stable at, 26% for main budget, 29% for consolidated. And that is, remember, we increased VAT and personal income taxes in recent years, and it didn't bump up that ratio, which shows you that, we can't rely on higher tax rates. So it needs to go to expenditure cuts to balance this. Capital we can't cut because the size of the cuts are actually bigger than the whole capital budget. All right, so it needs to be current expenditure, and their salaries and goods and services are the main items. And there are some tough I'm happy I'm not the one talking to the unions about that. But there are some tough cuts that needs to be done there. And I think there needs to be a social compact. And then that is, I think, the important thing that we as a society will have to talk about. Because here, it's about the general interest versus the particular interest. And the particular interests here are the particular interest of civil servants. But there's a bigger society out there in terms of the poor, the unemployed and so on, who are not earning these salaries. I think the minister highlighted that, Keta, is that 40% that public servant salaries went up in real terms in the last decade or so. That's a huge increase, more than the private sector actually went. So, we need to talk about those trading off those interests. So that is just, I think, briefly my comments as to the challenges that I think we will face. But I think the big issue will be the social compact that we will have to negotiate over the next 2 or 3 years to rein in these things and to talk about what is possible and what is not possible. Thank you very much.
I think we now come to that interesting moment. Can you please ask your questions to our presenters, please? So I would like Mr. Best and Mr. Dlamini to come so that you can engage their presentation. Any takers? Professor Peterson first, Professor Prakash Naidu. Please don't be shy. This is a safe space, we often say. Asive, please, for those of you whose names I may have escaped me, even if I don't know it, please introduce yourselves. So I'll start with Professor Francis, Professor Prakash, Asive. So before Asive, I'm trying to ensure that there's a balance, gender and some feminine voice. So Asive, before you, I'll take the lady at the back, and then I'll have you. Would that be okay? Thank you. Please give the mic to Prof. Peterson.
I've got the mic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Program Director. I just wanted to know, we are currently actually in technical recession. So I want to know, although the National Treasury is not the implementer, there's a lot of other things that needs to happen. But I would like to know, if Moody's downgrade us, what pressure does that actually put onto the current budget? We know, and you in fact also have indicated, that this is a politically fraught budget, which meant, I think the reason why you're saying that is there need to be negotiations between the union and government that needs to happen. Now, if that doesn't succeed, where does it, if those two things, if we got a downgrade and that discussions or negotiations aren't successful, is there a plan that we haven't seen that's somewhere in the drawer, but what will your response be on it? I presume that you will take these questions and then respond to them collectively.
Thanks very much. Thanks to Kita and Andile. I think you guys have done a fantastic job, and when you have young people like you come and present, I think it's a good sign, because you need to come more often. So when our students hear you and make the demands for allowances, etc., they will understand there is no money. But I'm also glad with the Vuleka Mali thing, because we sometimes battle to get money from municipalities for bursaries they promise. So we can check what the cash flow is and say, but you've got money. So thanks very much, and really exciting presentations. So I actually have 2 questions, right? And you can cut me short if I... So my first question, and when I listen to, I must say up front, this is one of the better budget presentations we had from the minister, right? Over many years. But one of the issues is around the sovereign wealth fund, right? The name sovereign wealth fund suggests if you're wealthy, then you create a fund. Obviously, we are in huge deficits. And I was thinking, why was this presented as creating a wealth fund? Is there a hidden agenda around it? Is this going to be a slush fund or something like that? So I think maybe some understanding on the wealth fund, what it will do and how will it help the sort of stricken communities already. The second question is more at home. We have an higher education budget, okay? Not much is going to change there. I mean, I'm glad that NISFA's funding at least will remain there. But the minister proposes, and I know it's a political decision, instead of 26 universities, we're going to get 27 universities. I'm very happy because my hometown is in the Ekurhuleni, okay? But the challenge with that is the current budget of those 26 universities will be top slice to provide for that. I mean, does it make economic sense? And obviously it's a political decision. What happens, it constrains us because we're actually going to get lesser funding. And how would we find a way with that? Thanks very much.
Shall we go with those questions? Shall I take those 4 questions? Or do we want to take one more? Okay, let's take one more.
Hello, I just want to thank you very much for coming and firstly state I'm actually a law student. I don't have anything to do with economics.
Much better.
Yeah, but I'd just like to know, with regards to Eskom, as you've already stated, Eskom is one of the major causes of greenhouse gases. So I'd just like to know, what is the government doing into looking into renewable resources and whether they are going to be pumping money into solar energy, wind power and things like that? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Hard questions. Very, very hard questions. Look, Vice Chancellor, I guess we don't really budget on, I guess this is our best view. This is our best view of the public finances, taking into account the risks, particularly this one on downgrade risks. You know, as Andisile and I were flying in to the airport, I saw Bram Fisher Airport, and I remember that final quote that the minister gave, that this is our case. We lay it before the nation, whether we live or die, freedom or something shall rise again in Africa. So on the downgrade, look, I think many commentators have raised the point that, look, it seems to us that a downgrade is priced in. A country on a Baa3 rating usually has a stable debt path, usually has faster growth than us. So, you know, in terms of like our bond prices, we're going to try and prevent a downgrade. I think this budget is very positive in the sense that it shows our level of seriousness at achieving fiscal consolidation. At the same time, we have to admit that it doesn't present a stable picture in terms of the budget, in terms of debt stabilization. And so it does mean, you know, if we're frank, that, well, you know, Moody's is going to have a very hard time justifying to their committee whether we shouldn't be downgraded or not. But I don't want to preempt that discussion. I think there's much to be hopeful about in this budget. There are many steps that we're taking that are very, very difficult. If the discussions between government and the unions don't succeed, I mean, look, it's a risk to this budget. It's a risk that's going to materialize in the next 2 weeks. But it is a big risk to the government. But I think, you know, short of that, there's not much we could do. But you're right. If it doesn't succeed, it does mean that, you know, we will have to reconsider many of the plans laid out in this budget. And to your point about the technical recession, look, at least that we expected. So we knew that the Eskom shock. If you look at our growth assumption for the full year, it was 0.3%. And I think the full year assumption is 0.2%. That's the real year outcome. So in that regard, I think at least maybe that particular, the technical recession is somewhat factored in. But again, it will require that we rethink those things. So that's our view. We're going to work with Professor Berger to think about how else we can strategize in the public finances. You at least you know that we do these engagements very well, very often. On the sovereign wealth fund, look, again, that's also quite a tough. I can assure you though that it's. I did not think of it as a slush fund. Certainly not. Maybe Andisile will get some of the slush fund money if there is. But I think our thinking around the sovereign wealth fund is that you're right. The deficit situation is quite high. We've accumulated a lot of debt. And so the question is, how do we achieve intergenerational fairness? We don't leave the next generations with the problem to solve, how do they pay for all of this debt? So in our thinking around a sovereign wealth fund, we are basically signaling that we will be running fiscal surpluses. Our long-term objective is to run surpluses that then are able, it's a tool that can act countercyclically, so that when there's a shock to the economy, we're able to then leverage that particular sovereign wealth fund instead of going into debt capital markets. Because another thing, one of the things is that when there's a generalized recession like the global financial crisis, the terms on which you borrow as an emerging market are quite onerous. So we've tended to borrow short. If we haven't borrowed short, it tends to be very expensive debt that over time we need to then service. So perhaps this is a tool that can assist in saving those. The Kurulin University. Well, look, what we said in the budget, and it's certainly not in the baseline. So let me put it like this: it's not in the baseline. So it's not in the actual budget. I guess it's one of those statements where we say it's like a political decision. But what we've said in the budget speech is that the money that's allocated to the Department of Higher Education and Training will be used to run a feasibility study on the possible establishment of a university in the Kurulini region. So it's by no means a fait accompli. But I'm also not saying that we shouldn't do it. But I'm just saying that we'll be thorough and methodical about whether or not we decide. At least we would advise that our principles are thorough and methodical, because I guess we don't decide, right? We'd advise on being thorough and methodical. This question on renewables and I guess decarbonizing the budget is probably the most important question that we probably can ask, I think, given the urgency of the climate change agenda. So the big thing, as I said, is around the renewables programs, this renewable IPP program, and how it sits alongside a transformed ESCOM. Now, if you see, the IRP prioritizes a lot of renewables. So 17 gigawatts of energy will come from wind, and about 2 gigawatts will come from solar. Some of it will come from coal, unfortunately. But, it's also one of those questions of we only contribute 1% of total climate emissions globally, which is about the same amount as global aviation. And so how do we decarbonize the economy without killing the economy? So it's one of those questions. I'm part of the working group on climate change, financing climate change mitigation. And so we're thinking about these things. But, I think what we are trying to shift away our approach from is it's just a financing and budget issue. Financing and budget's very important, but it's a broad restructuring of the economy, how we do life, basically. And we need to think about how do we facilitate that particular societal change. And the budget can only be a tool in that particular instance. It's just about, what does collective action look like in that particular circumstance. Right. Next round of questions? All right.
So I want to be fair because Asive, and you had your hand up, and you'll be third and fourth. If you ask your questions quickly, then we may have the last round. But if not, then we may say this one is a... Thank you very much.
We're here the whole day, so
don't rush it up. We need to be productive so that debt issue is...
Greetings, good morning to everyone. One of the things that the President had mentioned in the State of the Nation address was the 64 billion rands over the next 10 years to address issues of student accommodation. Now, I'm not sure where if it is reflected in the budget. I've just found out now that as far as Ekurhuleni is concerned, that that is not in the budget, and that in fact, by your own admission, that it is a mere political statement because it is not factored into the numbers. So it is worrying because then it begins to, then the other questions that we want to ask ourselves is, of some of the commitments that the president have made, which of them are but mere rhetoric? You are also asked to explain the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Hey, I saw you ducking and diving. So I really would like to find out, is it factored in the issue of the accommodation? And to show that from our side it's not an issue of rhetoric, the reality of the matter is that we do not have beds. In this particular institution, just in Bloemfontein alone, I think we have around about 30,000 students and no more than 6,000 beds. Now you do the math, where do the other students live and stay and sleep? Now, with also the issue of the accreditation, the reality is that it's also not going to work. And you might not be necessarily responsible for this. That be might for DHEAD, but to give you a sense of what we are speaking about. Like, for instance, you cannot accredit Rondavels and say there must be a bathroom. Where's the bathroom? Because there's not even the basic infrastructure from the municipality for there to be water. And we have rural-based institutions of higher learning. Then the question is, what is the plan? So I see you are drinking water. That is how dire the situation is. And then the second one, would you consider a post-schooling education and training tax to fund higher education? And then the last question is with regards to the wage bill, the reduction of the public wage bill. What impact would this have, number one, on service delivery? We understand that already as we speak, there's a shortage of staff in hospitals, there are not enough police. We have been saying, for instance, our students are being mugged and so forth, and we are saying we want police to patrol. They are saying we do not have staff. So what impact will this have? And the president has not ruled out retrenchments. He said it will not necessarily lead to retrenchments. We might just want to deal with the issue of the increases. My time is getting finished, but I want to find out as to what impact will that have on service delivery. And then also, you are bargaining, but my understanding is that the current wage agreement with the bargaining council only ends next year. So what if the unions, as Prof has asked, they say to you, no, we want our increase as we've agreed from the 1st of April 2018 up until the end of the 3-year term. So those things. Thank you very much.
I'm Molam Legas. I'm a third-year student doing statistics and economics. The professor in the front has already asked questions regarding the Wealth Fund. But now what I wanted to ask is regarding the NHI, given the situation at the SOEs, the PIC, and also the fact that the health department has negligence claims against them well into the billions, if not more, then why would National Treasury approve, or if you haven't, such a proposal? Was that clear? I'm not sure about that. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Ben, and I'm a political student here in the University of the Free State. So you came in a good time because I have an assignment on the budget. I'll
write it for you.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions. The first question is that the former president, when he stepped down, he declared that there will be free higher education. So my question is the National Treasury ready to fund free higher education? My second question is that it has just been on the news recently that the government will be spending 250 million to bring back home those people in China. So my question is, that is the risk that the government is taking. Should coronavirus hit South Africa, will the National Treasury be ready? Thank you.
Oh, is that the, I thought, is that
Good
the last?
morning.
Oh, sorry, good morning.
My name is Geraldine Spanda, and I'm a historian. Well, I came here determined not to say anything, but I couldn't help it. Largely because there seems in your budget statement, in the South Africa's budget statement, not to be learning from history. And not particularly South Africa's history, but I'll draw parallels with the neighbor Zimbabwe. I have so many parallels to draw, but the first one is on education. I think that it's important for a nation to fund education. However, that should be matched with employment creation. Because for the first 17 years in Zimbabwe, the highest funded budget item was education. And that was not matched with employment creation, which is a trend that South Africa is also a path that South Africa is also going towards. So I think that there should be a balance. In 1997, for instance, in Zimbabwe, we had 200,000 or so graduates per year, and yet the economy was only providing for 45,000 new jobs. So I think there needs to be a balance there. And the second lesson is on parastatals. Well, you call them SOEs. That was a huge problem in Zim. And you need to think about what exactly in those parastatals are you funding. I haven't had an opportunity to look at the estimates, but the problem arises.
Debt.
Sorry?
We're funding debt.
Oh, you're funding debt. Oh, okay, I see. That could...
And corruption.
Well, but before we get to everybody's favorite subject of corruption, there's always over-financing of operations and recurrent expenditure. I'm not sure if that's the case in South Africa, but if it is, that strategy really needs to be, revised. Because looking at how much they would spend of the total budget per annum, is it worth it to fund operations? Is it worth it to fund recurrent expenditure? And then the other issue is the wage bill. You're talking about reducing the wage bill, which should happen because of the expenditure levels that the government currently has. But however, when we tried that in Zim, we had a different goal. So it's all about what exactly are you targeting. The problem in Zim is that we targeted posts. We didn't target salaries. So are you going to, we shouldn't just wake up and say 600 posts are going to be cut. But what impact do those posts have on the budget? Okay. And lastly...
Oh, no. I think that's fine.
Lastly, on debt, you have so many examples of countries, not only Zim, that have gone the HIPIC route, the MDRI route, and I do not understand why South Africa continues to have so much debt.
Okay. Well, thanks, Geraldine. I'm actually reading a book as well on the end of apartheid, and I think I've learned the lessons of history, because I think there's a thing where they're quoting the guy who came after Verwoerd, I think it's Foster, when asked about what are you gonna, this apartheid thing is a problem, how are you gonna fix it? And he says, it's a problem for our children to solve. This debt is not a problem for our children to solve. Well, I was someone's child, as I said, Vice Chancellor. I wasn't there when this debt was made, but I'm trying to solve it. So let me start from the top. And I think the first question was around. Look, first of all, let me say to the SRC president former SRC president, that look, budgets are political statements. So it's not to criticize, or it's not to dismiss anyone's discussion or the SONA to say that a budget is a political tool. It's a tool that the governing party has at its disposal to achieve its manifesto commitments, right? So it's a very political tool, and we understand our role in the civil service around that. So it's not to dismiss what the president said. It is, however, to say that, just because of the timing of the State of the Nation address and the budget, it's only 2 weeks. What you want to run is a very high quality budget process that is responsive to political pressures, but also at the same time, realistic. And so some of these things you just need to give time. So it's not to dismiss anything that was said by the president, but it just is to say that some of these things aren't reflected in the budget. They may be reflected in the budget. In some cases, what we're saying about the allocation for the university, for example, is that a feasibility study will be done. Money will be allocated for a feasibility study. And that is, I think, giving effect to a political statement. On the university accommodation, so we've got the infrastructure fund, and I think what the president was referring to there was the 96 billion rand that's been set aside in the infrastructure fund for student accommodation. So, look, I can't necessarily address the specific issues that you're talking about here at the University of the Free State, but I mean, I think that is one of the priority area of the infrastructure fund. So when we talk about 10 billion rand over the next 3 years allocated to the infrastructure fund, a lot of it will go to the the fulfillment of the 96 billion rand in student accommodation. How is that undertaken? How do we bring in the private sector? I know students tend to be a bit more leftist. I was also a very leftist student, Vice Chancellor, but look at me now. The PISA tax. Look, that's a very good thought. I mean, we would consider it. There's like a lot of tax policy research that we've put out there. Our sense, though, is that look, public universities are a social good, and I think maybe there was some truth in the discussions around fee-free higher education, in the sense that public, university education is a public good. We all benefit from university education, and so, maybe society does have to share in the costs of funding university students, particularly poorer universities. We're just saying that we need to take into account the budget constraints and the tax revenue constraints, but there's nothing illegitimate in saying that. And again, I'm like, putting a lot of caveats around what I'm saying. But there's nothing necessarily illegitimate in saying that society must think about sharing the costs of the higher education system in a lot more equitable way, particularly for a government that is progressive and is committed to socioeconomic rights of the poorest of people. Then yes, of course, we should make the pathways available for people to take into university. So, look, the NSFAS model has given us a lot of problems, because that's like you could argue that's an earmark tax. It's given us a lot of problems in terms of implementation. So maybe if as a society we make that choice, that's a choice we make, and Cecilia and I will be on hand to implement it. Impact of wage bill on service delivery. As I said, we're not cutting posts, we're not cutting people's salaries. What we're trying to do is control the growth of the wage bill, right, as a share of the budget and as a share of what goes into revenue. So we're not looking at cutting posts. We're not looking at fighting with anyone. We're really looking at a negotiation to have a wage bill that grows more in line with the general economy and inflation. On the NHI, it was, I guess, one of those things where you also again have to be very cautious on what we say. Look, there is a problem of cost growth in healthcare, private sector and public sector. There is a problem of cost growth. There is a problem of poor management of the public healthcare system. We agree. And what we're saying is that we need some sort of resolution mechanism. It is also the case that, yes, as things stand, the economy is not growing very, very quickly. And if you tap into those revenue sources, what kind of revenue sources are available to fund the NHI? So I don't want to pronounce, because that's a Department of Health matter. I don't want to pronounce, but again, when a political decision is made, right, we stand ready to make sure that that political decision is made or is implemented in a way that is sustainable for all generations, not just us here or the Keta that's going to come along in a couple of years from now. We are funding free higher education. So that this year is the third year of that particular announcement by President Zuma. So all students, I know there's some administrative issues. So if anyone is like on NSFAS and maybe has having issues. I know there's some administrative issues that are being sorted out, but as it stands, that's the policy of government. We are funding that policy. So close on about 800,000 students in South Africa are benefiting from fee-free higher education. Obviously, we need to sort out the administration of the NSFAS to make sure that people that qualify for the program actually receive the program that they actually receive the funding that they qualify for, and we'll be working towards doing that. So someone will have to remind me on the the coronavirus 250 million rand. Look, those are citizens. They are entitled to the support of their government. Maybe I shouldn't use that word. But those are citizens, and I think as a caring society, we ought to do what we have to do. We can't just leave people out there. Now, are we ready for the coronavirus? So 310. Well, I guess you guys know something that I don't. 310 billion rand in this budget 2020, is made available to the Department of Health. Now, one of the things that budget needs to do is be responsive to public health crises, right? It's not just 310 billion rand that you just slosh around in particular ways. We need to make it in such a way that budget is responsive to public health crisis. Look, Geraldine, I think what you talk about here is, I guess, the issue of an industrial policy. What this paper, the Towards paper that we published, is thinking about is exactly some of these issues that you raise. Is that we need an industrial policy that absorbs a lot of these pressures that we highlight in the budget. So in the MTBPS, for example, we make, for example, the case that even though we have very poor higher education outcomes in the basic education sector, it is also the case that the number of graduates that are qualified, or the number of bachelor's passes that we're getting in the basic education sector, is growing at a much faster rate than what's the spaces that are growing at the university. So actually, even though we have an underperforming education sector, it is in some senses overperforming given how much resources we're allocating. So it's thinking about this coherent industrial policy. That's what this Towards paper is trying to achieve. That's what the budget process tries to achieve. Parastatals, again, I think it's sort of those issues I think would neatly dovetail into what does an industrial policy for South Africa look like that makes sense. And look, we don't profess to know all the answers. I think we rely on university training. As I said, Philippe, I've reread and reread your papers when I'm struggling with issues that I have to go and present to the finance minister, who, by the way, is an economist, so actually wants to see nice regressions. So I think that's where the university sector, we rely on the university sector. Vice Chancellor, I sat with many of your predecessors, or your predecessor, but other vice chancellors in thinking about how do we fund this particular sector more equitably. So we know we don't profess to have all of the answers, and I think what we look for, even beyond this engagement, is how we can engage with institutions of higher learning, with academics such as yourself, to, I think, to my friend, the university SRC president's point, achieve a much fairer outcome, much more equitable socio-economic outcomes. All right.
Yes. I just would like to demonstrate to you, using Vulega Mali, one of the questions which was asked, especially when it comes to the issues of data. You can use a keyword as well. You were referring to university beds, for example. And the interesting thing is that you can browse through and you can see there that there is a particular sub-program within, it's actually under university education, and you can see there is some text, but you get a link where you can go deeper there. I suppose because I know what I'm looking for, I can just search that term, university beds. It's not moving.
It's not there.
It is there. It is there, and in fact, it's on page, I think I know, it's on university education.
It's a performance indicator.
Okay, let's do this. Okay, accommodation. Not that one. Not this one. Okay, let me just check. And I already did this search and I found it using my mobile phone.
IT systems.
Maybe we could have older versions.
I can see. I can
Go to the
see.
Free State yet.
Oh, there we go. Yes. Okay. If you read this paragraph, but you'll see there at the end that university infrastructure under university education program and 8.8 billion allocated, and then, but in the end, the allocation is expected to contribute to the department's aim of developing 200,000 new university beds, facilities, basically. Well, there's no distribution here. It's just a global one for the country. So these are the kind of things that you are able to find on Vuleka Mali. I think we're done with the questions.
No.
Okay.
I actually asked more questions if you don't mind.
Okay.
I would like to take questions. You did say you've got the whole day.
So I'm aware that there must be some of us who are still passionate and want to ask questions. Can you raise your hands, please? Yes. Yes, sir. Who else? Oh, is that the last question?
Yep.
Really? You're certain? Okay. Yes, please.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity. Mine is just to ask your view.
Your name?
Oh, my name is Mojaki. I'm a former economics also student. I'm an economics graduate, let me be clear. So mine has always been on policy. I have a big interest on policy and alignment. Because what happened in the Mangaung, my worry was that there were conversations prior, the Auditor General reports that were submitted prior. Because I also check on municipality money. I check the reports now, and I think they ended 2018. But we are starting to engage this conundrum now in late 2019 to 2020, where it was taken under administration. So my worry was that the alignment from the national to the provincial, how does the accountability, or what makes sure that things are aligned? Because we can have a national agenda in terms of national treasure, we can have a theme. How is that taken down within the provincial or municipality department? Because my conundrum always lies that they are the ones that are supposed to provide the service to the people on the ground. So it makes it very conundramatic to engage on a national level. But we are here, the people that we are the receiving end, the people that are supposed to be giving us that are not engaging us at all. Because that was my worry to say, it should be taken to say, if we are going to engage this on a national level, that alignment and accountability must be there, because that's what I'm worried about, because there's a lot of us that can contribute to resolving some of those issues, but we find ourselves in different spaces because it's not speaking to that. Because you gave us an opportunity for the National Treasury, we would like to go there, but knowing that our provinces are being dealt with. It's not nice. It hits home knowing that you have the capabilities of doing that. So my worry is just that alignment. How do you make sure that the national aligns to the provincial and the municipalities and local?
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, that's chapter 3 of the Constitution, cooperative government, okay? So we've got an intergovernmental relations framework set out in the Constitution. And I think to your point around alignment, look, each sphere of government has powers and responsibilities and functions of its own, and I think you want to allow each sphere of government its level of autonomy. So we're not necessarily a federal government, but it is respecting that autonomy. And to your point, look, the National Treasury can do so much. So we manage the intergovernmental, the division of revenue, which is managed by our Intergovernmental Relations Division. Again, the division of revenue is a constitutional concept, right? But as we are doing here, as you question us, as you're like, I would think very, very tough on us, right? As public officials or civil servants, right? Democracy works when you are holding those who are tasked with those particular powers assigned to them accountable. So it's not necessarily about the National Treasury then coming into Mangaung. We have powers around financial management in Mangaung, but ultimately it is about what are responsible and civil servants doing. And by the way, that means being very hard on Andisile and me, right? If you feel that this engagement doesn't meet the standard that you expect from your National Treasury, then it's also about being hard on us as well. That's how democracy works. Which is a wonderful way to end this panel. It's wonderful. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
One question. Please, there's one more last question from my side. Motelisi Charles, a tax lecture. So I only have 2 questions. It's more or less the same as the one that was asked previously. National Treasury's responsibility. Number 1, alignment for cost cutting, right? What is National Treasury's take on cutting costs in terms of aligning the performance agreement with the fruitless expenditure, fruitless and wasteful? I'm not going to focus on irregular expenditure because most emphasis is based on irregular expenditure. For fruitless expenditure, fruitless and wasteful, I mean, PFMA and MFMA are clear to say it's supposed to be paid within 30 days. And it's not being paid within 30 days. As a result, there's interest that you are now supposed to be covering. Number 2, National Treasury's responsibility in terms of monitoring service delivery against the expenditure, because most of the time, the local government and departments, including national departments, sometimes they do not spend. And then right at the end, when National Treasury is supposed to receive back the money in terms of, they want to now start talking about virements, shifting of funds. And at the end of the day, the public would have not yet received the service delivery. But the money was standing with them. They were not using the money for the service that was intended for. Those are my questions.
Now that's getting. Would you have any thoughts, like from a part, because you guys do manage the environments from expenditure planning? No? Oh, you didn't hear the question? Okay. So look, around those, as I sort of pointed out in this particular slide, by the way, there's a budget review, and I wish I'd brought a copy, but if you go to the National Treasury website, there is it's not as slick as the Vuleka Mali portal, unfortunately. This was designed in the 90s, because clearly when I was just click here. If we click, is it not working? So I just want to show you this. So if your interest is understanding the policy, by the way, you had Lisecha Khanyago, who's my mentor. When I was a university student, he was the DG of the National Treasury, and I've benefited a great deal from him. So I hope you guys enjoyed that particular info. So there's a thing called budget information, right? And if you go to national budget, right, this is the budget that the minister was presenting. Then we have the budget review, and some of you will know this. So if you go through the budget review, there are different chapters, one of which is the division of revenue and spending by provinces and municipalities, right? In some cases, in many cases, we then go into some of the issues that you raise in a lot more detail than I can. And I would encourage you to look at the Treasury website, particularly this budget information section, especially if you're going for interviews at like your provincial or your national treasury. Chapter 1, 2, and 3, very, very helpful. But this provides a lot of information. Then if you go under publications and you go to say, I wanted to say, well, there's the Intergovernmental Fiscal Reviews, for example, which might answer some of your questions. There's also a Section 71 reporting, which I'm not too sure where it is, but it's somewhere. Here we go. So if you go MFMA, right? If ever you're doing I had a student who was helping with their master's dissertation, and I pointed them to this particular web page because they were doing a research project on municipal government. Rich data source, okay? Very rich data source. So I'd encourage you to look at this particular website. I mean, I'm sorry, I can't necessarily get into your particular question because that's like very, very detailed around the functioning of the MFMA and the PFMA. But look, there's a wealth of information that you can get within the, aside from Vulega Mali, by the way, which is something we're very proud of. But there's a wealth of information that you can get from the Treasury website. So really would encourage you to have a look at that. And, get in touch with the Treasury. We're always happy to field questions. A lot comes, so we don't necessarily answer all that quickly. But, Vice Rector, you've got our contact details. So if there's a question, if there's some data requests, we've done a lot of data work analysis with this university, and we're happy to continue that collaboration.
Shall we close on a positive note where I'm introducing a competition? I think for all those who have their devices or even their computers, you can just go to, in fact, what I will do, I will tweet it and even tag the university handle where you can get the link. It's basically on create.vulekamali.gov.za. Create.vulekamali.gov.za. There's a competition, 10,000 rands up for grabs. For anyone who can make use of our data on Vulega Mali, and you can visualize, tell any story on any aspect of your interest, whether it's a particular policy area, whether it's a particular, whatever. Just go into Vulega Mali, and then I will tweet that in just 1 minute, and tag the university handle, so you can get that link there. And so there is a deadline. It's actually the 9th. The deadline is the 9th, which is like tomorrow. So get cracking. All the best.
So thank you very much. I'd like to really express our excitement and gratitude, and hopefully this will not be the end of Treasury engagement with us. So thank you to Mr. Best and to Mr. Dlamini. Can we give them a round of applause? I definitely hope Professor Berger, the faculty, but also Professor, I saw that Prof. Heidi was here, that maybe there would be opportunities for us to then ask what are the implications of this for our own learning opportunities. What would students in economics, in accounting sciences think through these issues and the competition? So I really have been excited and thought this was one of the best opportunities of learning about policy development in our country on budgeting systems. The second expression of gratitude is for us to have our Vice-Chancellor not only being the first to ask the question, and a very critical question. I heard Mr. Dlamini saying this is one of the 8 engagements where we were asked the most difficult questions and had to really go deep into information sources so that we can give constructive responses. So, Prof. Peterson, we thank you for always making it the UFS a platform for knowledge and knowledge base, knowledge development, but also the science society interface to ensure that we do have presence and social impact, even whilst we're at the center of the country. It's their first time, actually, to come to the UFS. So I'm just trying to say they should visit the center a lot more often, then they will discover the rhodium, the platinum, and really beautiful resources that sometimes you only think are available in the coast or in Gauteng. No, there's really beautiful gems of knowledge and talent at the University of the Free State and in our partner universities. And I'd like to thank you, Professor Berger. It was very evident from when Mr. Dlamini commenced that you're quite active in trying to ensure that we as a university are partners in the development of knowledge, in policy advisory, and ensuring that our country makes the best decisions in the policy systems they develop. So I was really excited that you also agreed to be the respondent, to make it align with how we in the academy like presenting these activities. Thank you very much, and the presentation was well received. And the good thing is you didn't just speak to economic and management scientists. You also spoke to us who are lay people in this discipline, but we really understood. So thank you very much. Then we have our stakeholders who are partners of the University of the Free State in the provincial efforts to ensure that knowledge is cool, higher education or the post-education system is what you as young people in particular aspire for. So we have representatives from Maluti, the rector or the principal, Mr. Mabena, is available. And then, please remind me your name. Yes, Mr. Magai is representing Muteo. Yes, and so we're really appreciative. I apologize, but I needed to ensure that we... And then I would like to say the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic saw the call for expressions for universities to host these sessions and directed us to this. And we're really grateful that as colleagues, we often exchange opportunities for student staff, but also for our province to participate in activities such as this. And you know that events such as this never happen without people in the front, at the back, in ICT, and other spaces assisting. So I'd like to thank colleagues in community engagement, led by Mr. Ramatlele, and I'd like to thank Alicia Pina, the Dean of Students, and also the service providers who have helped us. We often deal with events such as this through our events and management team, but we've also had Zita playing a pivotal role in trying to coordinate, and so we thank you. So thank you very much to student staff, stakeholders, including people who are not necessarily from the universities, but also from community engagement clusters that we work with, and the deans here. Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned. The only announcement is that we are requesting the TVET representatives and the deans and the DVCs for us to meet at room 16 at main building for us to have a subsequent session with the representatives from Treasury. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. there's still a lot of us to do this afternoon so that we can reduce the debt. Thank you.
Grow the economy.